Calling online support. My name is Sam. How may I help you?
It's G as in Bravo, Z as in Delta.
Hello everybody, Nightmare on Scam Street here. As part of my general aviation series, I'm going to show you a flight I did between Glasgow and Dublin. But I'm only going to show you a part of the flight. The reason is the whole flight takes well over an hour, but all the interesting stuff happens at the beginning and the end. So my plan on this video is to show how to set up the plane so that it's ready for flight, fully loaded with passengers and fuel, and has all the right information of how to move from Glasgow to Dublin. For those who have been asking me if I'm going to be going back to other videos, the type I used to do, the investigative type, the answer is absolutely yes. I've got 3 videos that I'm making just now, and I hope to get one out in the next few weeks. So, Paul, I'm going to do a series of videos showing how, with no effort at all, you can steal other people's work and use it as a video that you appear to have made yourself, and also make a lot of money on the video from donations and super chats and things like that. So I'm going to go through the setup and show exactly what we do to get from sitting in the ground to flying, taking off from the runway. So sit back and watch, it's quite interesting. So, before we even go near the aeroplane, there's some admin work to do, which is basically to plan your flight. Now, airplanes don't just randomly wander around the sky. They have routes and waypoints that they have to adhere to, so that the air traffic controllers know where they are and where the other aircraft are in relation to them. What I have on the screen here is called Simbrief. That's Simbrief. Simbrief. It's actually free, and it is really the go-to piece of software for flight planning. So to do our flight to from Glasgow to Dublin, we can click on New Flight, and we scroll down to the options. Now, I'm going to use my own airline name, NOS, flight number 5, which makes it look like NOSS. I'm sure everybody who watches my channel understand that's Nightmare on Scam Street. Now, this is the airport that we want to set off from. Normally, you can scroll down through some of the earlier entries. So, Glasgow Airport is EGPF. So that's where we're leaving from. And we're going to Dublin, which I happen to know is EIDW. Now, you can find out what airport names are, airport IDs are, fairly easily. It's not hard to find them. So there we go. It's generated an alternate airport automatically, but we can make our own one. Then there's a date and time of departure. So if you wanted to depart, which is leave the gate at 5 to 12, that's where you'd set that. The planning system needs to know what type of aircraft you're running, because that could make a big difference to the way the height, the speed and so on. And here we're using the A320-200 by FENIX. Right, there are a number of aircraft that come with Flight Simulator 2020, and they're good aircraft, but they're not entirely functional. A lot of the controls are there for decoration, and you really can get frustrated when you want to do something that their system doesn't want to let you do. But that's not a problem, because you can purchase for quite a reasonable price the FENIX A320, and almost everybody that uses it online reckons it's one of the best flight simulator models there is. It's practically 100% functional. The only limitations that I can see at the moment are trivial, and it's an aircraft that I love to fly. So most of this stuff we can just leave as standard. We don't need to fiddle about with this. All of this, once again, absolutely standard, nothing to worry about. The dispatcher is the person who's responsible for making sure that the plane is loaded correctly. Now, I'm sure you realise that if an aircraft is heavy at the back because all the cargo has been put in the back, it's not going to fly. Now, the problem with the free version of Simbrief is that its maps are outdated. You can buy a subscription to the up-to-date maps. I haven't yet. I'm not in a position to do that, unfortunately. These letters and numbers here are actually the flight path. NORB1J is a route which takes you away from Glasgow, and NIMAT and NIMA2X are the ones that line you up to Dublin. The system then generates a map to show you what type of flight you'd be flying, and you can check it to make sure that you're going to the right place. So we're leaving Glasgow, we're heading to Dublin. If we can't get into Dublin, maybe because of bad weather or whatever reason, our alternate airport is Manchester. And the planning system has to make sure that there's enough fuel on board to get to Manchester if we cannot get into Dublin. So right now we have our flight organised, taking off from Glasgow, heading down between Belfast and the Isle of Man into the Irish Sea and into Dublin. What we want to do now is tell Simbrief to create that as an actual flight, because at the moment we're still in the planning stage. So we click on Generate Flight, and it will ask us if we want to overwrite any flight plans. Now, when you click on Yes, this flight becomes the current flight in Simbrief. And it's important that that happens, because when you go to load the flight plan into the aircraft, it looks for the newest flight. This is the flight plan itself. Lots of information on here. Most of it you're not going to be interested in until you get to a much higher level. But there are some things we need to look for in here. So very quickly, this is information that isn't going to change. We got CI, which is the cost index. That's roughly how efficient the flight is going to be. So we need to write that down somewhere. And the next thing we want to know is how high we're going to go. So these numbers here, 72, 105, 164, 209, and so on, are the actual heights that the aircraft, so 231 means 23,100. There's always two noughts on the end. But you'll see it goes up to 240 and doesn't go any higher. So 240 is what's called our cruise altitude, our cruise height. So we need to write that down as well. The next thing we need to do, this is a useful thing to do, is to save that flight as a Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 flight. So we just click on download and it'll save it into wherever your normal downloads go. We're pretty much done with Simbrief. The only other thing it can do is if you're using VATSIM, which is like an online air traffic control, real life air traffic control thing, you want to send your flight plan to them before you intend to fly so that they have it on file. So pretty much that's set up the flight before we go to the aircraft. Now we can actually get into the aircraft. If you open the flight sim, let it run up and click on world, you'll see it has from and to, but we're going to use a different system. If you click on the more button, it allows you to load a flight from your local PC. Now we just saved that flight and we called it whatever we called it, but it's just the newest one there. And you'll notice that the map on the screen is pretty much what we had already. That was our flight plan. But we need to adjust a couple of things. We don't really want to start off on the runway. The plane is programmed to be ready to fly if it starts on the runway. So what we're going to do, we're going to start on a parking gate, and we need to click that parking gate and set it to as departure. Then the flight sim will do some weird stuff and it'll probably change the way your plane was going to take off. It'll try and get it to the closest runway. We don't want to do that. We want to take off on the runway that we'd originally chosen. And the one that was in our flight plan. Now, our flight plan told us that when we left Glasgow, it was going to be via the Norbit departure. So once we click the departures, we'll see the Norbit 5J, and then the flight plan goes back to the shape we had before, which is great. That I've highlighted there happens to be another plane that's coming into Glasgow right now, or at the time I did this. You'll see that we're going from our gate right to the end of the correct runway. That's part one. The second part is organising what we do when we leave the Irish Sea and head into Dublin, because we have to tell the plane what runway we want to land at and how we want to get there. So there's going to be a few tweaks here and there to get that working right. So we're going to attack the Dublin end now, and as you notice, the flight path just comes straight at the end of the runway, and in fact it's even worse because it wants us to land on runway 34, so it's trying to twist us by 90 degrees instantly. I'm not going to run. I'm going to land on that runway, but we'll pick an approach, which is the one that we picked already, which was NIMA 2L. And if you see some of the weird approaches that happen, these are all weird approaches that happen because these are different flight paths coming in to avoid other aircraft and things like that. What I'm doing here is going down all the different approaches to find the one that looks the best. Now that one's not too bad. There's a little kink in it, but it's relatively good. That one's not as good. That one clearly isn't very good. And it's really just a case of playing with them until you find the right one. This is the cheaty way of doing it. The proper way is to have up-to-date maps. And the maps will tell you what the approaches are, and it'll tell you which runways are in use, and so on. So what we've settled for here is runway 28 left and the NEMA 2L approach. It's imperative that we write these down, because once we get in the airplane, we're not going to have access to this information again. So you need to write down the runway and the approach that we're going to take to it. When you click on Fly Now, Flight Sim does a bit of loading some scenery and stuff. And then it'll pop you on the stand that you sorted out at the beginning, which was actually gate 23. And it'll sit us in Glasgow at gate 23, which is where we wanted it to be. But the plane will be completely powered down. And one of the first jobs you're going to have to do is to power the plane back up again. And once Flight Sim is loaded, I'll show you how to do that. In fact, I'm going to skip a bit of this. So we suddenly appear at the gate. We click on Ready to Fly. And one of the first things that happens, if you have it set, is that the AI air traffic controller, or your co-pilot as well, gets clearance for the flight that you're taking. Now within that clearance there's some very important information. It tells us what temperatures and barometer readings and stuff like that, and it'll tell you the squawk. The squawk is a code that's programmed into the transponder, and it tells the air traffic control where you are. One of the first things we need to do is look at how to set the power on to the aircraft. There are two batteries, and I've just switched them on, and then there's an auxiliary power or external power. The startup process is beginning on the left side, and we're looking for any buttons that are white. We also need to test the cockpit voice recorder, because that's going to be recording our voices while we're sitting on the ground without engines running. The three knobs at the top are the navigation system, and they have to be turned on fairly early, because we want the navigation system to be ready when we are, and it takes a little time. Now we come onto the control panel, which is like a tablet, and on the FENIX sim you can actually use an external tablet, which is quite good. And from here we're downloading our existing flight. We've got to fiddle with the times a bit because of time differences. So we want to get a rough time off the gate, giving us about half an hour or so. And you'll see me fiddling around with this a little bit. Sometimes you have to take into account British summertime, winter, whatever. Now we can go to the METAR page, which is the weather reports. And what we're going to want to do is look at the weather for where we're going to arrive, which of course is Dublin. If you're really paying attention, you'll see I've made a mistake here. I've actually picked the alternate airport. We need to tell this system to load the aircraft. Now that means baggage, passengers and fuel. Well, in baggage as in cargo also. And if you have a look outside, you'll see that the cargo doors are open. The airway is linked to the aircraft. Now there are 3 possible time limits you can use for loading the aircraft. One of them is instant, but remember I told you that the navigation system needs a little time to settle itself down. Instant doesn't mean you can get flying more quickly, it just means you wait longer. We've switched now to something called the MCDU, which most people call the MCDU. And I pressed on init, which gets the information from the computer about the flight plan. And some of the information that we've got from other places, like remember we wrote down the cost index and the maximum height. We can also press the wind request button, which will give us all the winds at different altitudes for the length of the flight. The bottom right box is the transponder, and we're going to write in there the code that air traffic control gave us, and we're actually going to make the thing active because it sits there in a sort of switched off state. This is the pedestal. This is between the pilot and co-pilot seats. What we can do then is switch the radar system on, and we'll just leave that after that. So the condition we're in at the moment, we have no engines running, and we've just got main power coming from the ground. Now the ground generator usually just sits off to the right of the nose of the plane, and you just see it's like that white van with the generator behind it. But what we're going to switch on now is called the APU, or the auxiliary power unit. It sits in the tail of the aircraft. I'm sure you've noticed in flights before that the back of the aircraft seems to be very noisy. And that's because there is actually a jet engine in the back of the aircraft. That's where some of the air goes in for it, the air flap, and the exhaust is right at the very tail of the aircraft. Now we can power that up, then we have to wait about 3 or 4 seconds before we can press start, and that'll start that engine running. We can monitor how well it's going or how far it's gone by looking at the data screens. And right now I'm testing the fire alarms because I'm working my way down this panel. Test the smoke alarm, that's for the cabin hold. This can be a bit of a nuisance. Sometimes when you test it, it carries on going for a while. I believe that's fairly realistic. And there it goes again. It'll go away. Now we can have a look and see what's happening with the APU. If we switch to the APU control or button I should say, That's our fuel. I really want to shout at myself, switch to the APU, but never mind. Okay, so we've done our wind request now. And now we've got some more information to put in. Now, remember, EGPF is our airport, Glasgow. And we've got to tell the system how we're going to leave. So we're going to leave on runway 5. And we worked out that we wanted to use NORBJ. And if we put that in, that gives us a nice clean flight out of Glasgow. And we scroll down to the bottom of this flight plan where you see flight plan discontinuity. I'm going to click on Dublin and arrivals. We're going to land on 28 left. So we click that, and we know that we want NEMA to L. So we'll keep scrolling through the different stars, as they're called, standard approach routes, and we'll find NEMA to L. Click that and insert it, and that's the flight plan entered into the computer, which is great. You can test how this works by looking at the HD, one of the displays, the one on the left, which is like arced in red. If we move that pointer to plan, we can see our flight plan. We have to jiggle around with the focus, the zoom levels and things like that, so we can get both of the MCDU and that on at the same time. And as we scroll down the flight plan, you'll see the flight plan moving, and it's copying exactly what we were expecting it to do. And you'll see as we come towards Dublin, it'll do that little kink around, and then it'll come heading in for runway 28. And that grey double lines at the end of the green flight plan is actually the runway. So we're more than happy that that's okay now. Right, we've waited long enough now that the navigation system has sorted itself out. We want to set the weather, and we need to set the weather to real time, and real weather and real time. If you don't do that, it'll just give you basic values. So what we need to do now is go on to the ATIS for Glasgow Airport, and it'll read out what the various weather parameters are, like the temperature and the barometric pressure. The barometric pressure is the one we need, because we need to set those to exactly the right number. It's incredible that if we're just like 0.03 out or 0.04 out, so that can make a difference of 10 feet. And if you're coming in for a runway in very, very dense cloud or fog, that's a big difference. So you need to know that those are accurate. We're not very far off being ready to fly now. We have our flight plan plugged in. We're getting the actual weather now. This is from Glasgow Airport. It's updated on a regular basis. Depending on the changes in the weather, sometimes it's updated very quickly because the weather changes very quickly. So it's telling us that the QNH is 3020, which is the 3005. Sorry, I couldn't see it quite well. So we need to set both the pilot and first officer's barometer to that. There's also a standby barometer, which is set in the digital format 1018, and we need to adjust that as well. That's in case either of the two main ones break down. So we've reached the stage where our aircraft is laden, fully loaded, passengers all on, people are sitting down in their seats. We can, now that we're fully loaded, we know that we can also turn on the seatbelt lights. We'll run through a few checks on the panels just to make sure. You'll notice on this panel the APU is providing power. It's in the middle at the bottom, and the two outer ones are the engines. So we can actually turn off the external power supply now. The switches I'm turning on now are the fuel pumps for the engines. We're just going to dismiss the loaded, but there's some more things we have to do. There's some information we need to write down. We need to write down three things from this page. We need to write down the zero fuel weight, which is the number which comes on here. We need to write down the center of gravity for zero fuel weight, and we need to write down the bulk, which is the actual fuel that we've used. And the reason we need to do that, we need to make sure that we can actually take off from the runway that we've chosen under the conditions that we've chosen it. So when we do this calculation, most of the stuff goes in easily. These numbers on this side here, these are the speed parameters that we need to look for. V1 is the maximum speed you can go before you cannot be allowed to stop anymore. So once you've reached that speed, no matter what, you're going to be taking off. Because if you slammed on the brakes after that speed, you wouldn't stop in time for the end of the runway. VR is the rotation speed. Rotation is when you lift the front of the nose up and you start to take off. V2 is the safest speed that you can take off with only one engine. It's known as the safety speed. Now, remember the zero fuel weight that we had, 60.1, and we had the CG of 30.9. We enter that into there. The block 5.0 or 5.3, I mean, that goes in there. What this page does is then it calculates the time, the fuel that should be left at the end of the flight and things like that. So now I'm putting in the performance information like V1, VR, V2. Now, you always know there's a big thing when the V1 is much less than VR. On a perfectly dry runway with the wind in exactly the right direction, V1 and VR will be very close to each other. But with the if the runway's wet or damp or whatever, it doesn't match, and you need to be slower on V1 than you are with VR. I'm just filling in the last numbers which came off of that last page. I'll skip forward to the arrival section, and now we need to get some more information off of our FENIX page. We need to go to the METAR for our Edinburgh Airport, not Edinburgh, Dublin Airport. And we need to find three things. We need to find the QNH, which is the number that starts with Q. We need to find the temperature, which is usually a number / another number, so that's temperature and dew point. And we need to find the wind, which is usually something like 5 digits followed by a knot. So it's 300.02, which is 300 degrees and 02 knots. And we need that because we're going to put this into the MCDU. So we're putting 1017 into the QNH. Temperature, which I think was quite cold considering what we've had over the past few days here. And the wind, which was 300/8. So that's the conditions. It's what conditions are going to be like when we land. I also put the decision height. That's the height that we must make a decision. And because we're going to be using a full radio, or rather ILS approach, and with double ILS, we can be quite low for that last decision. Now we can get rid of the external power and the chocks that hold us in place. You see that blue thing is actually an arrow. This is a cheat that I use because I don't have up-to-date runway, airport runways and taxiway maps. Once again, if I could afford the maps system with Simbrief, I would have those to hand. So I use that cheat and it tells me which way to go. What I'm doing now, I'm starting engine number 1. Getting a few things ready for takeoff. I'm setting the flaps to the correct value. I'm setting the automatic braking to maximum. This is going to help us if we need to stop very, very quickly. There's various things you have to set, and the computer screen at the top actually tells you when you've got them all set correctly. On the MCDU on the right there, you'll see I'm reading company messages. These are load sheets that have been signed by the load master, and as captain you have to read them, accept them, and then that's like a legally binding document. So you should really check them well. I remember we had that CG thing, centre of gravity. Well, we have to adjust the trim here for that centre of gravity. There's a little arrow in that green band on the left, and you have to line up that with the number on the wheel. I'll do a bit more detail on that later. Started the other engine now. If we go onto the engines page, you can see that one engine's running, the other one's starting to run up. What the engines use is the APU. They actually use the airflow from the APU to actually start the engines. They're like compressors, which is exactly what they are. They're a compressor. But once the engines have started, we don't need the APU anymore. That's just burning fuel that we don't need it to burn. So we've done all our checks on the overhead panel. Just running down, making sure we can put the seatbelt signs on now. That's fine. At this point we should be setting our initial takeoff height, and I believe I left that off. Now here you can see on the middle screen there the takeoff settings page. What I'm doing there is looking which way I've got to push back. I'm actually going to have to push back and go around to my right. Then I can line myself up with the arrows as they lead out of the parking bay. So what I've done is I've engaged reverse thrust. I'm not using the tug. Because I've got a setting wrong, the tug from Flight Sim interferes with the tug from FENIX, and they're not mutually compatible. So right now I don't have tugs. It's something I can fix, I just haven't got around to doing it. So I use reverse thrust there to get us out. This is the pilot's eye view. As you can see, the blue arrows leading along to the taxiway. Now we've got taxiing permission and we can just start moving. The FENIX, the A320, the Airbus, takes very little power to move. At this stage I've just nudged the throttles forward slightly, and as soon as we started moving I've put them back to idle, and we're just rolling nicely. We don't need to go very fast. In fact, if we go too fast, the computer might think that we're trying to take off, which wouldn't be a very good thing on a taxiway. So while we're in this phase, I'm double checking all my settings. I'm making sure I've got the flaps set. That's me looking down, losing attention. Tiny bit of side wind there just pushed me slightly off position. So I stopped and got restarted again. I believe actually I was told by air traffic control to hold my position, but I didn't. It's only artificially intelligent traffic, it's not real traffic. If you're using VATSIM and an air traffic controller tells you to stop and you don't, you'll be getting a message to speak to them later, because they take it very seriously. The two red markers coming up ahead of me are the markers to the hold point for the runway. So I shall be stopping here, and then tuning the tower for takeoff clearance. That bar of white lines in front of me, or yellow lines, that's the indication that the hold point is very close. And this is the actual hold point coming up here. So I come to a complete stop. I'll switch over to tower. I'll request takeoff clearance. And unless there's something coming in or going out, I'll get takeoff clearance straight away. Notice the air traffic controller gives me an updated QNH, an updated barometric pressure, and I'll take this opportunity to adjust the barometers as we're taxiing to the takeoff hold point. And so it's crucial to have those correct. So we're just about to take off. We'll stop. We'll move the throttles up to climb power and hold them there for a few seconds until the engines have speeded up. So we're just double checking. We're just dinging the cabin crew to let them know that we're about to take off. That's sometimes when you hear that bing bong, that's that noise. So we're now pulling up the throttles. Both engines running. Now we'll just go up to flex and off we'll go. There's nearly always an alarm of some sort when you take off. Something disagrees with something. Now I need to just adjust the position of my viewing port a little bit so I can see the speeds. I should have done that before running down the runway at massively high speeds, but there we go. And once I reach VR, I can actually rotate and get the plane up in the air. So we'll get it up in the air. We'll get the gear up. Now this is where I made a mistake. I realized what I'd done because of the alarm. You see I'm changing the number on the top right corner of the screen. I'd forgotten to set that to 13,000 as I should have done. And right now I've engaged the autopilot. I'm trying to engage the autopilot to take over. I think it's a bit awkward when you're flying on a curve. It likes to be in a nice straight line with everything set up. But normally the A320 will pick up the autopilot very quickly. So I think that's as far as I'm going to go on this particular flight. The landing is the next thing. That's quite interesting. Right now I'm hand flying the aircraft. And if you look roughly in the middle of the screen, you'll see the black screen with the yellow radial sort of circles coming out of it. And at the bottom of that you'll see our actual route, which is a big curve to the left. And it's quite hard to get the autopilot to lock onto that. So I'm hand flying just now, which is no big deal. It's a lovely plane to fly. So right now, that's where I'm going to stop this video. And the reason is that the next stage, which is the cruise, is tedious, and then the landing, which is more interesting. There's quite a lot to do on the landing. It comes around fairly quickly. So with that, thanks for watching. Quite a lot longer than I'd hoped this video to be, but that's how it was. This is the pilot's eye view. It's in real life weather, and it's quite cloudy, as you can see. All the way through the flight you're being told to transfer from one air traffic controller to another, or different areas. So many thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next video when we'll be landing in Dublin. Just one last thing before I go. If you're not already a subscriber, I'd really like you to think about clicking on that subscribe button. You get notices of when I'm doing live streams, and there's going to be a lot of those from now on. Anyway, once again, thanks for watching.